Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I want to talk about the brand new card just revealed, Time Out, a new spell for Paladin, which looks a little familiar because it looks a lot like the card Ice Block. They have a ton of similarities. They both focus on making your hero immune. They just do so in different ways. So I wanted to compare these two cards and talk about why Time Out might be better or worse than Ice Block, a card which I think most people will agree was a little too strong, and in fact even Blizzard supported that notion by moving it to the Hall of Fame, no longer in the classic set because people got so frustrated by it. So the question remains, is Time Out better or worse than Ice Block competitively? Beyond that, is it better or worse for the game? Is it as frustrating or maybe even more frustrating to play against? So I want to talk through the strengths and weaknesses of Time Out through the context or through the lens of comparing it to Ice Block. Before I do that, though, I will say, generally speaking, I think we should just identify that becoming immune for a turn, that's a good thing. That allows you to do things like set up combos, find time to draw more cards, therefore creating more resources, finding answers to your opponent's board, maybe finding some heals, setting up a win condition with an OTK with things like Uther of the Ebon Blade, just finding lots of raw damage if your deck somehow supports that, which is unlikely in Paladin, but possible with things like Murlocs in particular. In wild format with anything can happen. So there are obviously use cases for Time Out, and on average, I think it's a solid card, a pretty good card that will find some sort of deck. But back to the main question, is it better than Ice Block? So let's talk about that. First off, I want to identify the things about Time Out that are better than Ice Block competitively speaking. Up first is the fact that it doesn't have counterplay. When you play Ice Block, there are secret tech cards out there, things that answer secrets or remove secrets from play. So in the past, if Ice Block ever became a really dominant part of the meta, those secret tech cards existed, you add them into your deck, and then suddenly you wipe out your opponent's Ice Block, therefore removing their ability to go immune. Time Out, on the other hand, because this is just a card that's played, very hard to set up any sort of counterplay for it. Now, yes, of course, theoretically, things like Counter Spell obviously could do it. If there was some other spell disruption option, or even things like Loatheb or Rebuke, do introduce a little bit of counterplay, but it's not direct, and often you'd still be able to find ways to cast that Time Out. So probably this works all of the time. 99.9% of the time, Time Out will go off and you will in fact make yourself immune. And that's more competitive than Ice Block because it just works all the time. Unfortunately, I do think that's a little worse from Ice Block from a fun standpoint, because you're just not going to have any way to interact with your opponent's hero once they cast Time Out. And in fact, because it's not a legendary, you could cast it twice, which means for a couple turns, you're just going to be sitting there without much to do. And as we've seen with freeze effects and of course Ice Block in the past, that's usually not a very fun way to play. And I think this is even less fun. So if this ever were to become part of a dominant meta deck, people are going to lose their minds over the fact that they can't interact with Time Out. There aren't answers. Now, maybe a card will be offered up in Rostacon's Rumble that does address that. We certainly don't know yet at this point in the expansion release schedule or reveal schedule, because not that many cards have been revealed. But as it stands, as we understand the game today, there's very, 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 very little counterplay for this card, which makes it good competitively, but annoying to deal with. Now, beyond that, another advantage that Time Out has over Ice Block is the fact that when you cast this, you still have mana remaining and you still have actions remaining. So Ice Block, of course, you play it and it just sits there and you forget about it and it does its thing, but it's only immune once it's triggered, right? Beyond that, it only triggers during your opponent's turn as a secret. So something like Fatigue has been a problem for Ice Block decks in the past. If you draw cards in Fatigue, it's going to kill you regardless of your Ice Block. With Time Out, you can cast it, and because you're immune until your next turn, you can then take actions and prevent damage right away. So for instance, if for some reason or another you wanted to draw a card or put yourself in a fatigue, say you're looking at things like Cold Light Oracle and Wild format, and both you and your opponent would draw cards, you could set up a Cold Light Oracle fatigue condition where you don't take damage from your card draws, but your opponent might. Now, that's a really specific example I think is unlikely to happen, but you get the idea. You can take damage via fatigue. I think the more common example is that if you have a weapon in Paladin, you can cast Timeout, and then you could use your weapon to attack a minion, and you won't be taking that damage because you will be immune. So there are ways to immediately give yourself some healing or benefit from the timeout that Ice Block simply doesn't provide. That said, I do think that aspect is a minor benefit at most. It's just going to save you a few health points and really won't be the way that timeout becomes a compelling card or influences the game in a major way. It's going to be those really key turns where you're setting something up or buying yourself time. I don't think being able to attack a minion with a weapon is a huge difference, but could still have a direct impact on games from time to time. All that said, let's go ahead and talk about some of the aspects of timeout that are worse than Ice Block. Some reasons I think this card might struggle compared to Ice Block. So the most obvious one to me is the fact that unlike Ice Block, which you set and forget, with timeout, if you want this to actually prevent lethal damage, which Ice Block just does automatically, you have to time it really well, which is kind of funny given the name timeout. It's not just always there, and it doesn't trigger automatically when your opponent hits you for that lethal hit. So you have to know exactly when you're about to die, and you have to play it exactly then. So if your opponent surprises you because they have, some burst damage in hand you weren't expecting, you might just be sitting on a timeout that you should have played, but you missed your opportunity, so instead you're dead. And that's a really, really big downside, right? The fact that knowing when to play this thing, and then, as we'll see below, requiring yourself to submit that mana and commit to that mana in that turn are both huge downsides for this thing. It's suddenly a lot more awkward to play. You have to time it, and you have to spend 3 mana, which you might not want to do in a given board state at a given moment because you need to do other things with your mana. So you're making a much bigger commitment to playing this thing and understanding how to stay alive with it. So that means you're probably going to have to save it until much later in the game, which means you can't flex the mana out early. So, for instance, an Ice Block deck might have 3 or 4 spare mana on a mid-game turn. They just play the Ice Block because they got nothing else to do. Timeout's going to be camped in your hand for a while until you feel like you have to play it. And then, of course, if it becomes a prominent part of the meta, your opponent knows that too, and they can start to align their resources and align their damage in ways that might surprise you, or set it up so that you have awkward turns, where if you need to play another big card, you can't do it at the same time you play timeout. So they create those lethal pressure pushes when you might want to be doing some other aspect of your deck. So to me, that's a huge degree of awkwardness, a much harder card to play, and a downside I don't think you can underestimate. So although there's no counterplay, sometimes the card in itself is almost like a counterplay because you gotta make it work, and that's not going to be easy to do. Now, as you look at this list, you see 2 good things and 2 bad things. You might say, okay, so it's about the same as Ice Block. Well, no, that's not actually my conclusion. In reality, I think the winner of this battle between timeout and Ice Block is Ice Block. I think Ice Block has far more consistency. It's much more flexible to play, and the small downsides it has don't really matter in the context of using a card like this where you're trying to set up some last-ditch effort or some cool combo. Those downsides aren't going to impact the game significantly at all. It's really the fact that this is flexible and timed exactly when you need it that matters. So Ice Block looks much, much better. Now, that said, of course, these exist in different classes. These exist in different metas and different formats between standard and wild format. So that doesn't mean timeout is an inherently bad card, just that Ice Block is maybe one of the best cards we've ever had in Hearthstone, and timeout is a suitable level below it. The unfortunate thing for me is that although it is weaker than Ice Block, which might make it seem less problematic or less frustrating or less annoying to deal with, I'm not sure that's the case. The fact that there is no counterplay means it's still going to be a card that gets on your nerves from time to time. Timeout, that is. A lot of time puns in this video. So I don't know that I love the design necessarily. I'm curious to see what kind of decks are able to utilize this successfully, and maybe they don't feel that bad to play against. Maybe they have other ways to interact. So perhaps we won't see that expressed right away. But to me, at the end of the day, that means Timeout captures some of the worst aspects of Ice Block without delivering quite as much of the competitive efficiency of Ice Block. So that leaves the card in a weird spot. But pretty clearly means Ice Block is indeed the winner. Now that said, I'm going to do a detailed review for Timeout later with a star rating if you're curious, but I think it's probably going to land around the 3-star mark. Maybe I'll be inspired and give it 4 stars, but I doubt it. I think it's going to be hard to play sometimes, and it might just fall into the gap as a relatively awkward card outside of some incredibly specific deck that finds ways to utilize it successfully as just another control piece or combo timing setup that buys you a turn or two, maybe in wild format in particular. That said, I'm curious though, what are your guys' thoughts? What about the differences between these cards? Was there something I missed? Is there a reason Timeout's actually way better than Ice Block or some other interaction that I didn't see? I'd love to hear those, so share that in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.